On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to take a look at the book of Deuteronomy and show you the Torah designs in Deuteronomy. As you may recall, we have already gone through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and have shown how that each set of 5 chapters each picture miniature Torah designs. That is, chapter 1 is a Genesis chapter, follows the theme that we see in the book of Genesis. Chapter 2 follows the theme in Exodus. Chapter 3 follows the theme in Leviticus. Chapter 4 follows the theme in Numbers. And chapter 5 follows the theme in Deuteronomy. And then chapter 6 through 10 follows the same 5 pattern again. Chapters 11 through 15 again. Well, guess what? The book of Deuteronomy is no exception, showing that all 5 of these books have a perfect design. Could not possibly have been designed by man, only by God. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the Torah designs in the book of Deuteronomy.
J.R., the Torah, the law, the books of Moses are so sublime in their structure. You know, in the last century, the Graf-Wellhausen theory, the German school of higher criticism, tried to rip the Torah apart into various sub-documents, J, E, and P, and D, and they postulated that the Torah had been written by several different redactors or editors, and had been written and rewritten and written and rewritten over the ages, until finally it ended up patched together. But this is impossible. I mean,
yes.
When you look at the inner structure of the Torah, you have a unity, an absolute unity. And it begins with the number 5 written all over it in the design: Genesis, creation; Exodus, redemption; Leviticus, holiness; Numbers, the wilderness march; and Deuteronomy, the final summary and judgment. And that pattern, J.R., is found through and through the Torah, written all over it.
Now, what is interesting to me is that the book of Genesis contains Deuteronomy chapters and Numbers chapters and Leviticus chapters, which means that the book of Genesis, when God laid out the book of Genesis, He knew there was going to be a book of Deuteronomy. So these things were very meticulously designed, had to have been designed in the halls of heaven.
They did indeed, and J.R., no man could have foreseen the end from the beginning. That's exactly what this is. You have, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the final disposition, you have the kingdom, and then certain steps to reach the kingdom. Only God could have envisioned these from the earliest days.
And they have been consistent down through history,
right.
Consistent in the life even of an individual, which, of course, we have seen on previous programs. Let's look at the book of Deuteronomy now and see these chapters. In dealing with the Genesis chapters, we're going to look at chapter 1, chapter 6, chapter 11, chapter 16, chapter 21, chapter 26, and chapter 31. Let's begin with chapter 1, Gary. What makes this a Genesis chapter?
Well, J.R., we call this book Deuteronomy, which is the second law in Greek. But its original title in Hebrew is Ha-Debarim, or just Debarim, the words. And based upon sentence 1 of Deuteronomy, these be the words which Moses spake unto all Israel on this side of the Jordan. This idea of word now is not just throwaway words. These are words written in stone, as we might say, the Word of God.
Actually shows us the divine nature of the alphabet,
yes,
and the structure of communications. Genesis 1 says, and God said,
right,
let there be light. In John chapter 1, Jesus is introduced as the Word, and the scripture there says, in the beginning was the Word. That makes this a beginning chapter, doesn't it?
It makes it an absolute beginning. And in Genesis we read, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And we have this theme in verse 10. The Lord your God hath multiplied you, and behold, ye are this day as the stars of heaven for multitude. He didn't say, today you're just a small people, and tomorrow you'll be as the stars. He said, ye are this day. He's looking off into the far future.
Yes. This is a beginning for Israel because in verse 38, Joshua is introduced to the people as the one who will take them in to the promised land. The scripture says, "But Joshua the son of Nun, which standeth before thee, he shall go in thither. Encourage him, for he shall cause Israel to inherit it." This is a Genesis chapter. What about chapter 6, Gary? What makes chapter 6 a Genesis chapter?
And turning quickly over to chapter 6, we have here, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." If there are ever words that mean something to the Jew, it's Deuteronomy 6:4. This is the Shema. This is the declaration of the one true Creator God.
These words are in the mezuzah that hangs on the door of every Jewish home, aren't
Yes, absolutely.
they? And, of course, this is the great statement, the great Shema, as Gary said. This is the statement that takes us back to Genesis. In the beginning, God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. Wow. That's Genesis, if ever I saw it. Let's look at chapter 11 right quick. What makes chapter 11 a Genesis chapter?
And by the way, we've moved quickly off of chapter 6, but it has to do with keeping God's commands, as does chapter 11. And again, we're going now, chapter 1, chapter 6, chapter 11, chapter 16, just jumping 5 chapters along. And chapter 11 is a command to study and obey God's commands, or a dictate. And by the way, J.R., this is the other half of the mezuzah text.
Wow. From chapter 6 to chapter 11, both Genesis chapters, both in the mezuzah.
That's right.
Only 22 lines in the little mezuzah.
That's right.
That hangs on the doorpost of every Jewish home. And part of them are from chapter 6, and the rest are from chapter 11.
And
that's incredible.
It is, and they repeat the Genesis idea. Verse 21 says, and this is the final words in the mezuzah, "that your days may be multiplied, the days of your children, the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers to give them, as the days of heaven upon the earth." In the beginning, it was this creation that moves right on out into the far future.
That's paradise regained, isn't it?
It certainly is.
That's
yeah.
the Garden of Eden all over again. That makes it a Genesis chapter.
Yes.
Well, Gary, let's look at chapter 16. What makes chapter 16 a Genesis chapter?
Well, you know, here in chapter 16, J.R., we have the festivals of Israel spoken of in condensed form. And guess what? We have, beginning with Passover, a rehearsal of the feast. Well, J.R., Passover is the beginning festival, the beginning of the calendar.
It's in the first month of the year, isn't it?
It certainly is.
Month number one. That's great. That's a Genesis chapter for sure. Let's look at chapter 21 and see why chapter 21 of Deuteronomy follows the theme of Genesis.
Now, this is a chapter that speaks about legalities that come to daily life and the law of marriage, the law of the rebel. We have here, J.R., we have here the law expressed in terms of the tribes as they are given to exist in perfection.
And what I see here is the home. I see husband and wife, the various domestic regulations they have, the prodigal son, for example, under the law. And this certainly speaks of Genesis and the first home, Adam and his wife Eve. For example, the prodigal son reminds me of Cain. And so we have, I think, a Genesis chapter here.
Yeah, verse 21 is specific here that if you have a son who is absolutely rebellious and is a glutton and a drunkard and so forth, he is to be taken outside and stoned. And this rebellious son idea comes to us out of the book of Genesis, as you say,
Yes.
Cain.
Now let's look at chapter 26 and see what makes that chapter follow the theme of Genesis. And Gary, I think verse 1 and 2 is just really profound here.
Well, and it shall be when thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance, and possessest it, and dwellest therein, that thou shalt take of the first of all the fruit of the earth, which thou shalt bring of the land that the Lord thy God giveth thee, and shalt put it in a basket, and shall go unto the place which the Lord thy God shall choose to place his name there. This is the law of giving. It's the law of the tithe. And J.R., this harkens all the way back to the Garden of Eden.
That's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah.
All the produce and the fruit of the land, and the land being the promised land, it certainly is paradise regained. Back to paradise. Chapter 31, quickly, Gary.
Quickly.
Well, I tell you what, we'll take a break. We'll get chapter 31, the final Genesis chapter, when we return in just a moment. Deuteronomy is a book that holds a Torah design throughout. As we have seen the 5 themes of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, in a miniaturized form, we see these in each set of 5 books in all 5 books of Moses. We have showed you Genesis in sets of 5s. We've showed you Exodus in sets of 5. We've showed you Leviticus in sets of 5s. We've showed you Numbers in sets of 5s. And on today's program, we're looking at Deuteronomy in sets of 5s. We have seen the Genesis chapters. We've come down to chapter 31. Gary, tell us, why is chapter 31 a Genesis chapter?
Well, interestingly, J.R., it almost exactly repeats chapter 1. That began, these be the words which Moses spake. Chapter 31 says, and Moses went and spake these words unto all Israel. It's again, he's saying, here it is, this is the word. And then he begins to talk about the keeping the law. He charges Israel to not to hide its face from God's grace. And he goes all the way into the latter days. He says, I know that evil will befall you in the latter days. And so,
predicting their fall, just like Adam's fall.
Exactly. He's predicting the fall of Israel.
And I notice he's 120 years old here. That's a good Genesis number.
It is a good Genesis number. It was an age of man given in the book
from chapter 6, no less, of Genesis.
Chapter 6, that's correct.
Now let's look at the Exodus chapters. Chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 12, chapter 17, chapter 22, chapter 27, and chapter 32 of the book of Deuteronomy. Tell us why chapter 2 is an Exodus chapter.
Now, Exodus, of course, is the story of the deliverer, Moses, and coming out of the land of Egypt. Remember, that is the theme now. We're talking about deliverance, redemption.
It's the wilderness journey, isn't it?
Yeah.
The midbar.
It is the journey. It's the beginning of the journey. And here we have in Deuteronomy 2:1, then we turned and took our journey into the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea. There it is, J.R. What can you say?
The Red Sea.
The Red Sea.
It's fascinating.
That's Exodus.
Chapter 7 is also an Exodus chapter. It follows the theme of Exodus. Gary, tell us why.
Well, sentence number 1 of chapter 7 says, when the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, and then he names the nations. Well, this is, again, God's command to conquer Canaan. It's basically the idea of the Exodus coming out of Egypt. By the way, in this chapter we have this sentence, in verse 8, but because the Lord loved you, and because he would keep the oath which he had sworn to your fathers, hath the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you out of the house of bondmen from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. If that isn't an Exodus theme, I don't know what is.
It's amazing. And then, of course, this chapter deals with separation. Be separate from the people. Well, that's what Exodus is all about, it's to separate themselves from Egypt. Let's look then at chapter 12 and discuss the Exodus theme.
And again, now we're getting into Exodus, and in this case, we're talking about the sanctuary. One of the features of the Exodus, besides the giving of the law, was the giving of the entire system of worship, including the tabernacle. And we have that here, the statutes and judgments. And we also have a forecast. Verse 10 says, but when you go over Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God giveth you to inherit, and when he giveth you rest from all your enemies round about, so that you dwell in safety. Again, it is rehearsing, repeating, expanding the theme of deliverance.
And redemption.
Redemption.
Chapter 17 is also an Exodus chapter. And there I think we can see chapter 17 and the beauty of its design, Gary.
And chapter 17 again speaks of sacrifices. It speaks of the law. It speaks of having 2 or 3 witnesses. It speaks of administrations of various kinds, including administrations to the king. And verse 16 of this chapter says, "But he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses, for as much as the Lord hath said unto you, ye shall henceforth return no more that way." In other words, don't go back to Egypt.
That's great,
That's
isn't it?
Exodus. Isn't that amazing?
Yes, it is. Chapter 22 is also an Exodus chapter. It follows the Exodus theme, Gary.
The Exodus theme here, now this is, again, talking about law in an expanded form. It's talking about the law of the brother's property. It's talking about the law of separation and talking about the law of marriage. These are the finer points of the law, and again, it's an expansion on the law of Moses. The law of Moses has certain very fine points in it, but J.R., in this chapter, they are clarified. For example, verse 13 says, "If any man take a wife and go in unto her and hate her, and give occasion of speech against her, bring an evil name upon her, and say, I took this woman when I came to her, I found her not a maid," then you go on to the very fine points of what to do in a case like that. And there are other cases given, so we have here a refinement of the Mosaic law given in Exodus.
And you know that law of separation also harks back to Exodus, when they should separate themselves from Egypt, just as we saw in the previous Exodus chapters.
True.
Let's look at chapter 27 now and consider its Exodus theme.
And again, Moses, with the elders of Israel, is commanding the people, and he's saying, keep all, this is verse 1 of chapter 27, keep all the commandments which I command you this day. And this is very much an Exodus type commandment. And in verse 10 we have, "Thou shalt therefore obey the voice of the Lord thy God, and do his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day." Of course, Moses, the great lawgiver.
And finally, chapter 32 is an Exodus chapter. Chapter 32, of course, is particularly interesting to me. It is the Song of Moses.
And J.R., this is complicated. The Song of Moses speaks of the rock, capital R, 5 times, and that rock is a picture of Messiah delivering his people. We have also in here shall we say, a full-scale prophecy that extends over thousands of years. It talks about Israel forgetting the rock, and then it talks about the latter-day deliverance of the people by this rock. And I can't help, I honestly go back to the book of the Exodus. Twice Moses had an encounter with the rock there in the desert. And that rock is a picture of Christ.
Exodus chapter 17, he smote the rock.
He smote the rock.
First encounter with the rock, water out of the rock. Then, of course, we have here in chapter 32, the Lord found him in a desert land, in a waste, howling wilderness, and led him about. He instructed him, kept him as the apple of his eyes. An eagle stirreth up her nest, fluttereth over her young, spreadeth abroad her wings, he beareth them. And we can see the Exodus here.
Yes, we can.
Obviously. And then, of course, in the end of days, when Israel comes back home from their exile, that is an Exodus greater than the original Exodus. So chapter 32 follows the Exodus theme. We have just time enough to introduce the Leviticus theme, Gary. Let's look at chapter 3. Whet your appetite.
Leviticus talks about the holiness, walking with God, and being separate. Now, J.R., in chapter 3 we have the conquest of the giants, and we have the granting of land to the 2.5 tribes, and that would be on the east side of the Jordan. And this chapter concludes with a charge to Joshua, and that's verse 28, to charge Joshua and encourage him and strengthen him, for he shall go over before his people, shall cause them to inherit the land which thou shalt see. You know, Joshua is a type of Christ, very much so. And Leviticus typifies Christ.
Yes. Let's look quickly at chapter 8 and see its Leviticus theme. Here in chapter 8 we have warnings and exhortations, again, just as we did in chapter 3.
Indeed. And we have here basically a command to be holy. All the commandments which I command thee this day shall ye observe to do, that ye may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers. And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness. Now, this idea of a way and walking with God is very much a theme of Leviticus.
And chapter 13, we have just less than a minute, but I think we have time to get 13 in. It's the story of the prophet.
We have, yes,
That's
it is.
Leviticus, isn't it?
If there arise among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams. Verse 4 says, ye shall walk after the Lord your God, and fear him, and keep his commandments, obey his voice, and ye shall serve him and cleave unto him. That is really the heart of the meaning of Leviticus, this close walk with the Lord.
Obviously, we're about halfway through our study here, so we'll conclude it on our next program, but it is fascinating to note that Deuteronomy is divided up into sets of 5 chapters each. In fact, there are 7 of these, with the exception of the last one, and there are 4 in it, with 1 remaining chapter left, and we'll tell you why that chapter is yet remaining when we return next week. We'll be back in just a moment.